The neighborhood of Maplewood Estates had always been quiet, almost unnaturally so. Every lawn looked identical, every mailbox was the same shape, and every hedge was trimmed to the exact same height. It was a neighborhood built on order, rules, and the watchful eyes of the homeowners association. To the residents, this perfection was comforting. But to Ethan, a man who had spent most of his life on a farm before moving to the suburbs, it felt more like a cage. When Ethan and his wife bought their modest two-story home at the end of Willow Drive, all he wanted was a little piece of his rural past, a few hens, a small coop, and the sound of clucking in the morning. To him, chickens weren't just animals, they were therapy. After his military service, Ethan had struggled with anxiety and sleepless nights. Caring for the birds brought him peace, a sense of normalcy that pills and counseling had failed to give. At first, nobody noticed the coop. Hidden behind the backyard shed, it was small and quiet. The hens were clean, well-fed, and produced fresh eggs daily. Ethan even shared the eggs with his neighbors, leaving cartons at their doors as friendly gestures. For months, everything was perfect. That is, until she arrived. Karen moved into the house directly behind Ethan's, a large corner property with a spotless yard and a glittering SUV parked in the driveway. She was the kind of woman who saw the neighborhood as her kingdom. Her lawn was the greenest, her dog the loudest, and her complaints the most frequent. Within days of her arrival, Karen was attending HOA meetings and volunteering for the Neighborhood Standards Committee. She had a reputation for spotting violations before anyone else did. It didn't take long before she noticed Ethan's chickens. It started with small things, the sound of a faint cluck early in the morning, the flutter of wings over the fence, or a stray feather carried by the wind. Karen didn't see animals, she saw chaos. To her, the chickens represented rebellion, a challenge to her perfect, rule-abiding world. And Karen was not the kind of person who ignored such things. One morning, Ethan found a neatly typed note taped to his front door. It read like an official notice: poultry is strictly prohibited under HOA Section 4.3 of Community Standards. Immediate removal required within 7 days. The note wasn't signed, but Ethan didn't need a signature to know who it came from. He sighed, folded the paper, and tucked it in his pocket. He had expected this day might come eventually. But what he didn't know was that this would be the beginning of a war, one that would shake the neighborhood to its core. The following week, the HOA formally contacted him. Karen had filed a complaint, complete with photos of his chickens and copies of the bylaws. The HOA demanded immediate compliance or face daily fines. Ethan tried to explain that the hens were clean, quiet, and harmless. But the board didn't care. Rules were rules. That night, Ethan sat in his backyard, listening to the soft coos of his hens as the sun dipped below the horizon. He felt the familiar weight of anxiety press against his chest, the same suffocating feeling he'd battled for years. Losing the chickens felt like losing the one thing that kept him grounded. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. He'd faced worse battles before, ones that required strategy, patience, and precision. As he watched Karen's porch light flicker on across the fence, a new idea began to form in his mind. A way to fight back, not with anger or defiance, but with something stronger, the law itself. The war with Karen had just begun. And by the time it was over, she would wish she'd never filed that complaint. The letter from the HOA wasn't just a warning, it was the first strike. Within days, Ethan began receiving notices in the mail, each one more aggressive than the last. The fines started at $50 per day, accumulating relentlessly. The letters called his chickens livestock, his coop an unauthorized structure, and his actions a violation of community harmony. Karen's fingerprints were all over it. Every morning, Ethan would see her standing by her fence, pretending to water her flowers while watching his backyard. Her dog barked at the chickens whenever they appeared. Sometimes she would take photos on her phone, zooming in as if gathering evidence. It was clear, this was personal. She wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was trying to break him. At the next HOA meeting, the situation reached its boiling point. The board members, all dressed neatly, all smiling politely, treated Ethan as if he were some kind of criminal. They spoke of community image and property values, repeating Karen's words almost verbatim. The final verdict was swift: remove the chickens or face escalating penalties and potential legal action. That night, Ethan sat alone at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of letters and violation slips. The clock ticked quietly. Outside, he could hear his hens settling in for the night, their soft coos a reminder of what he stood to lose. He thought about the past, the long sleepless nights after returning home from service, the endless restlessness that haunted him. The chickens had been more than pets. They had been therapy. Routine. Calm. Purpose. Taking them away would be like tearing away his peace of mind. And then he remembered something. Months earlier, during a counseling session, his therapist had mentioned the benefits of emotional support animals. Not just dogs or cats, but any animal that could help a person manage mental health challenges. The term had seemed vague back then, but now, it sounded like a lifeline. Ethan opened his laptop and began to research. Hours passed as he dove into articles, legal codes, and government websites. He learned that emotional support animals, or ESAs, were recognized under federal law. They weren't considered pets, but rather therapeutic companions protected under certain housing regulations. Landlords and associations couldn't discriminate against someone with a legitimate ESA, even if their policies prohibited animals. The realization hit him like a spark in the dark. If his hens were recognized as emotional support animals, the HOA couldn't legally force him to remove them. He could keep them, legally, permanently, and with official documentation. But to pull it off, he needed to be careful. He contacted his therapist, explained the situation, and shared how caring for the chickens had stabilized his anxiety. After a detailed evaluation, the therapist agreed. The chickens genuinely helped him manage his mental health. Within a week, Ethan received an official letter, signed and stamped, certifying his hens as emotional support animals under the Fair Housing Act. It was a small victory, but to Ethan, it felt monumental. When he sent the documentation to the HOA, their reaction was immediate: confusion, disbelief, and anger. Karen especially couldn't accept it. She began rallying neighbors, spreading rumors that Ethan was faking his mental health claims to keep his birds. She accused him of exploiting the system, calling his hens a nuisance wrapped in legal paperwork. But Ethan had done everything by the book. The HOA consulted their attorney, only to discover that Ethan was right. Federal law trumped community policy. They could fine him all they wanted, but they couldn't legally force him to get rid of his emotional support animals. When Karen learned this, her fury reached new heights. She started documenting every sound, every movement, even every feather that crossed her yard. She emailed HOA members daily, urging them to find another way. The chickens, oblivious to the chaos they caused, continued to peck peacefully in the grass. The balance of power had shifted, for now. Ethan had found a way to fight back, not with aggression, but with intelligence and patience. Yet deep down, he knew Karen wouldn't stop here. She wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. As autumn leaves began to fall and the air grew colder, Ethan noticed strange things. His trash bins mysteriously overturned, odd noises at night, and tire tracks near his fence. Karen's war had moved from rules and paperwork to something far more personal. Ethan knew this wasn't over. What had begun as a petty complaint was evolving into a full-blown neighborhood battle, one that would soon draw in the HOA, the police, and the entire community. And through it all, Ethan remained calm, feeding his hens in the quiet dawn, waiting for the next move. The crisp chill of late autumn had settled over Maplewood Estates, but in Karen's heart, the cold had turned to something far more bitter. Ethan's victory had humiliated her. She had prided herself on being the enforcer of neighborhood order, the guardian of perfection. Now, because of one man and a flock of chickens, her authority had been publicly challenged, and worse, defeated by a loophole. To Karen, this wasn't about chickens anymore. It was about control. From her living room window, she could see the coop in Ethan's backyard. The sight of those hens scratching peacefully in the dirt burned her every time she glanced out. She started keeping notes, not just about Ethan, but every person in the neighborhood who had ever crossed her. She documented everything: who parked on the street, whose lawn had weeds, who left Christmas lights up too long. But her main focus never changed: the chickens. Karen began crafting a new plan, one that would destroy Ethan's credibility once and for all. She knew that legally, she couldn't touch the chickens themselves. But laws were complicated things, and she was determined to twist them to her advantage. She started digging into HOA records, calling city departments, even contacting animal control. She asked questions, endless questions, about noise ordinances, sanitation standards, and zoning regulations. She wasn't looking for truth. She was looking for ammunition. Soon, she found it. Buried deep within the city's health code was a rule stating that any animal structure within a residential area must be kept a minimum distance from neighboring property lines, a rule that predated the HOA's own guidelines. Technically, Ethan's coop was a few feet too close to her fence. It wasn't a major violation, but to Karen, it was gold. She filed a formal complaint with the city, attaching photos and claiming the chickens were creating unsanitary conditions and attracting pests. She even went as far as sprinkling a handful of birdseed along her side of the fence before taking pictures of rodents she claimed were drawn by Ethan's coop. Within a week, a city inspector showed up at Ethan's door. The man was polite but firm, informing Ethan that a complaint had been made and an inspection was required. Ethan allowed him into the backyard, confident everything would check out. The inspector noted the clean conditions, the lack of odor, the well-maintained coop. But then his tape measure came out, and Karen's trap snapped shut. The coop, though spotless, was indeed slightly too close to the fence line. The inspector explained the rule, assuring Ethan it was a minor issue that could be fixed by relocating the coop a few feet. Ethan nodded, polite and cooperative as always, but inside, he was furious. He knew who was behind this. He could practically feel Karen's eyes watching from her window. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat on his porch, staring at the coop. The chickens clucked softly inside, oblivious to the storm that surrounded them. He wasn't angry at the inspector, the man was just doing his job. But Karen's obsession had crossed a line. The next day, Ethan moved the coop himself, complying with the city's order. It was tedious work, but he did it without complaint. He even sent photos to the city inspector confirming the adjustment. The case was closed. But Karen wasn't satisfied. If anything, seeing Ethan comply so calmly only infuriated her further. She began escalating. Late at night, she would throw small stones at the fence, startling the hens. She'd leave anonymous notes on Ethan's door claiming neighbors are concerned about diseases. She even called local media outlets, trying to pitch a story about illegal backyard farming in Maplewood Estates. None of it worked, until one night, when things went too far. It was a Saturday. Ethan had gone to bed early after feeding the hens and securing the coop. Around midnight, a sound jolted him awake, a sharp thud, followed by the squawk of terrified chickens. He rushed outside, flashlight in hand, only to find the coop door swinging open, its latch broken. One of the hens was missing, the others scattering in panic. He searched the yard and surrounding street for hours, but the missing hen was gone. The next morning, as the sun rose, he noticed something horrifying. In Karen's trash bin, set out neatly at the curb, were a few loose feathers. It was never proven, but Ethan didn't need evidence. He knew. That was the moment something changed in him. He had tried to be patient, reasonable, and calm. He had followed every rule, every legal step, every request. But Karen had crossed the line from harassment to cruelty. It was no longer about rules, it was about justice. So Ethan decided to fight back, not with anger, but with something Karen would never expect, strategy. He began documenting everything. Every noise. Every photo. Every strange incident. He set up small cameras along the fence line, hidden within garden decorations and solar lights. He kept a log of every time Karen approached his property or contacted the HOA about him. He was building a case, not for the HOA this time, but for the law. And as the days passed, Karen's behavior grew bolder, her frustration deeper. She believed Ethan was powerless. But the truth was, he was quietly preparing to expose her. The calm before the storm was ending. Soon, Maplewood Estates would witness a battle unlike anything it had ever seen. One that would drag the HOA, the city, and even the media into the chaos. And when the dust settled, only one of them would still be standing. The first frost of winter crept across Maplewood Estates as silence blanketed the neighborhood, but beneath that calm, tension was brewing. The war between Ethan and Karen had grown far beyond a simple property dispute. It had become a test of patience, intelligence, and resilience. And this time, Ethan was done playing defense. He had spent weeks quietly preparing for this moment. Every night after work, while Karen scrolled through HOA message boards or peeked through her blinds, Ethan reviewed footage from his newly installed cameras. He had placed them discreetly, tiny lenses hidden within flower pots, birdhouses, and the corners of his fence. What he found was both infuriating and validating. Karen wasn't just harassing him, she was stalking him. The videos showed her walking along the property line at night, tossing small pebbles toward the coop. On some evenings, she'd lean over the fence, holding her phone flashlight as she peered inside. Once, she even tried to unlatch the coop door again, but this time, Ethan's reinforced lock held firm. Every incident was logged, time-stamped, and backed up. He had hours of evidence, more than enough to prove harassment and property interference. But Ethan knew if he wanted lasting results, he needed more than proof. He needed to expose Karen's obsession in a way that couldn't be ignored, by the HOA, by the neighborhood, and by Karen herself. That opportunity came sooner than he expected. The HOA had scheduled their annual open meeting for December, an event where residents could voice concerns and review the year's issues. Karen, of course, had been preparing for it for weeks. She had drafted a new proposal, Community Animal Restrictions, revised Section 4.3. It was her latest attempt to ban any non-traditional pets, including chickens, rabbits, and even certain dogs. She was confident it would pass. But Ethan had plans of his own. On the day of the meeting, the community hall buzzed with chatter. Residents filled the seats, some out of curiosity, others simply for the free coffee and snacks. At the front table sat the HOA board, 5 members who looked both tired and nervous. Karen stood near the podium, clutching her papers like a general preparing for war. When it was her turn, she launched into her speech with fiery passion, describing Ethan's chickens as unsanitary, dangerous, and detrimental to property values. She waved printed photos, claiming they showed evidence of infestation and odor problems. Some residents nodded, others frowned. But just as Karen was about to finish her triumphant argument, Ethan calmly raised his hand. The room fell silent as he stood up. He didn't speak with anger or accusation, only calm precision. He began by acknowledging the HOA's role in maintaining community standards. Then, he explained the legal process he had followed, the emotional support animal certification, the compliance with city codes, and his recent relocation of the coop. Every word was measured, factual, and unshakable. Then, he pulled out a small USB drive. He asked the board to display footage on the projector, evidence of ongoing harassment and property interference by a member of this community. What followed stunned the entire room. The video clips played one by one, Karen at night, tossing objects over the fence. Karen leaning with her flashlight into the coop. Karen pacing along the property line with her phone camera. The final clip showed her opening the coop gate, the night Ethan's hen had disappeared. A collective gasp spread through the audience. The board members exchanged uneasy looks. Karen's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she tried to interject, but the evidence spoke louder than any words she could muster. Ethan ended his presentation with quiet dignity. He reminded everyone that he had never violated the law, never disturbed his neighbors, and had gone above and beyond to comply with every rule. Then he turned toward Karen, not in anger, but with a calm, almost pitying stare, and thanked her for bringing so much attention to the matter, since it allowed him to demonstrate how much harassment veterans with emotional support animals often face. It was a devastating blow. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming the videos were taken out of context, but her voice shook with panic. The board quickly adjourned the meeting for private review, and residents began whispering among themselves. Some gave Ethan nods of support, others shook their heads at Karen's behavior. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood knew. Word spread quickly, the HOA's self-proclaimed enforcer had been caught red-handed violating the very rule she championed. Several residents submitted formal complaints against her, citing her pattern of harassment. The HOA, desperate to maintain its image, called an emergency session and suspended Karen from all committee duties pending investigation. For the first time in months, Ethan felt peace. He walked into his backyard that evening as snow began to fall softly, blanketing the ground. The chickens clucked contentedly inside their coop, warm under the glow of their heat lamp. He breathed deeply, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs, a weight lifting from his shoulders. But as he turned to go inside, he noticed something. Karen's house, once immaculate, was dark, curtains drawn, driveway empty. 4 days afterward, she didn't appear. No noise, no notes, no glares from the fence. It was as if she had vanished. Ethan should have felt relieved. But deep down, he knew someone like Karen didn't just disappear. Silence wasn't her surrender. It was her regrouping. And soon she would return, with something far worse than petty complaints or HOA meetings. The next chapter of their battle was about to begin. For a while, it felt like peace had finally returned to Maplewood Estates. The streets were quiet, the HOA was silent, and the soft clucking of Ethan's hens once again filled the air without tension or fear. Winter had settled in fully now, the trees bare, the roofs capped with frost, the days short and gray. Ethan had begun to relax again, enjoying small routines, morning coffee by the window, gentle chores in the yard, evenings reading by the fire while the hens slept soundly in their coop. But peace, as Ethan would soon learn, was only the calm before the next storm. Karen had not disappeared. She had retreated, wounded, humiliated, but not defeated. Her suspension from the HOA had stripped her of her authority, and her reputation in the neighborhood had crumbled. Neighbors avoided her now. Mothers pulled their kids away when she walked by. Even the board she once commanded refused to answer her emails. And yet, in her mind, Ethan was the villain who had destroyed her standing. She spent her days obsessing over him, watching, plotting, seething. Her world had become small and narrow, consumed by the thought of revenge. She was no longer trying to win back her position. She wanted to ruin Ethan entirely. It began with small, almost unnoticeable things. One morning, Ethan discovered his garbage bins knocked over again, their contents scattered across the street. He assumed it was the wind. Then came the footprints, deep, clear prints near the fence, left in the snow late at night. A few days later, he noticed scratches on the coop door, as if someone had tried to pry it open. He reinforced the lock and checked his cameras. But strangely, the footage from that night was blank. The files were corrupted. Someone had tampered with them. Ethan's sense of calm began to unravel. The anxiety he had fought so hard to control crept back in. Every creak of the fence, every rustle of wind made his heart race. He tried to stay rational, to tell himself it was coincidence. But his instincts, honed from years in the military, told him otherwise. He was being watched again. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, slid under his front door with no return address. The words were typed in bold, blocky letters. You can hide behind your fake emotional support claims, but everyone knows you're a fraud. The truth always comes out. No signature. No hint of who had written it. But Ethan didn't need a name. The tone was unmistakable. He reported it to the HOA and to the police, but without proof, there was little they could do. The officer who took the report was sympathetic but cautious. Keep your cameras running, he advised. Document everything. If this escalates, we'll have grounds to act. Ethan did exactly that. He upgraded his security system, adding motion sensors and backup storage. He placed warning signs around his yard, 24-hour surveillance. But even with those measures, the sense of violation lingered. Karen's next move came weeks later, when the snow began to melt. One night, around 2 a.m., Ethan awoke to the sound of frantic squawking. He rushed to the window and saw smoke curling up from the direction of the coop. Heart pounding, he threw on his boots and ran outside. Someone had tossed a small firework or smoke bomb into the enclosure. The hens were panicked but unharmed. Ethan managed to douse the embers quickly with a hose, coughing through the smoke as adrenaline surged through him. The next morning he reviewed his footage, and there she was. Karen. Caught in the camera's motion-triggered night vision, her face partially covered by a scarf, holding something in her hand as she crouched near the fence. The timestamp matched the incident exactly. That was the breaking point. Ethan took the footage straight to the police. This time, they didn't hesitate. The video was clear, direct evidence of criminal harassment and attempted property damage. Officers visited Karen's house that afternoon. She denied everything, of course, but when confronted with the footage, her confident facade cracked. The HOA board held an emergency meeting the following day, not to discuss chickens or rules, but Karen herself. After hours of discussion and review, they voted unanimously to remove her from the association permanently. A restraining order was filed, banning her from approaching Ethan's property. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered, shocked at how far things had gone. Many of them quietly reached out to Ethan, apologizing for ever doubting him. Some even offered to help repair the damage to his coop. For the first time, Ethan felt the community stand behind him instead of against him. But even as Karen's downfall unfolded, Ethan couldn't shake a sense of unease. People like her didn't simply fade away. Her hatred ran too deep, her pride too fragile. Losing her authority, her reputation, and her control had broken something inside her. Something she might never recover from. Days passed. Karen's house went dark again. No car in the driveway, no lights at night. It was as though she'd vanished. Ethan hoped that meant it was over. He focused on rebuilding, fixing the coop, repainting the fence, cleaning the yard. The hens, resilient as ever, seemed to sense his calm returning. Their steady rhythm of life, feeding, laying, resting, soothed him once again. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the yard, Ethan noticed something that froze him in place. A single chicken feather, not from his hens, but tied to a small rock, sat on his porch step. Attached to it was a note, handwritten this time. This isn't finished. Ethan stared at it for a long time. The street was silent. The lights in Karen's house remained off. But in that moment he knew, she was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And whatever she planned next would be her most desperate move yet. Winter faded, and the first signs of spring began to creep into Maplewood Estates. The snow melted from the sidewalks, the grass began to show shades of green again, and the air carried a lightness that hadn't been felt in months. Yet for Ethan, that lightness never fully reached him. Every morning, he still checked the locks on his doors. Every evening, he reviewed the footage from his cameras before bed. The note Karen had left on his porch haunted him, not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. It was a promise. She wasn't finished. For weeks, nothing happened. The restraining order seemed to have worked, and the HOA's silence felt like closure. But Ethan had learned the hard way that silence, when it came to Karen, was never peace, it was preparation.
And he was right.
It started one windy night in early March. Ethan was reading in the living room when he heard a faint, metallic noise, not loud but deliberate.
He froze.
The sound came again, the latch of the backyard gate. He set down his book and moved quietly to the window. Through the glass, he saw a flicker of movement, a shadow near the coop.
His pulse quickened.
The cameras were already rolling, but instinct took over. He grabbed his phone, switched on the flashlight, and stepped outside. The yard was cold and still. The hens stirred nervously inside their enclosure, feathers rustling. For a moment, there was only silence.
Then, near the far corner of the fence, he saw her. Karen.
Her hair was disheveled, her face pale under the harsh beam of his light. She was holding something, a small crowbar, its edge glinting faintly.
Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to.
The cameras caught everything. She froze for a moment, then dropped the tool and bolted toward the side gate. He shouted after her, but she was already gone, swallowed by the darkness between the houses. He called the police immediately. Officers arrived within minutes, taking statements and reviewing the footage. This time, there would be no warnings, no leniency. Karen had violated the restraining order and been caught attempting to break into his property. When the police knocked on her door, she didn't answer. The house was nearly empty, furniture gone, curtains removed. It looked as though she had been packing for weeks. But in her garage they found something chilling, a folder filled with documents, photos of Ethan's backyard, and printed copies of his medical certification for the emotional support hens. She had even written notes in the margins, plans, dates, observations. She had been watching him all along, even after her suspension. The next morning, news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Police cars outside Karen's house, flashing lights, neighbors whispering from their porches. When the officers finally escorted her out in handcuffs, she looked more ghost than person, drained, broken, defeated. The woman who once ruled the neighborhood through fear and control was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. Ethan didn't celebrate. He simply watched from his window, silent. In the days that followed, life in Maplewood Estates began to change. Without Karen's shadow looming over every fence and flower bed, the atmosphere softened. Neighbors began talking again, laughing again. People started planting gardens, painting mailboxes in colors that once would have earned them fines. The HOA, stripped of its old rigidity, adopted new leadership, fairer, kinder, more human. Ethan's hens thrived in the warmth of spring. They clucked happily in the morning light as he spread fresh feed and refilled their water trays. Their feathers shimmered gold and white under the sun, symbols of a peace he had fought hard to earn. He had won, but not through anger or revenge. He had won through patience, truth, and calm persistence. A few weeks later, Ethan received a letter in the mail. It was from the HOA, but this time, it wasn't a complaint. It was an official notice recognizing his contribution to neighborhood harmony and perseverance. The irony made him smile. The very association that once fined him for keeping chickens was now thanking him for setting an example of resilience. Still, a part of him remained cautious. Trauma didn't vanish overnight. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the fence made him glance over his shoulder, if only for a second. But each day that passed without incident reminded him that peace, real peace, was slowly returning. One evening, months after Karen's arrest, Ethan stood in his yard watching the sunset. The air was quiet, except for the soft murmurs of his hens settling in for the night. The sky burned orange and purple, reflecting off the windows of the homes around him. He thought of everything that had happened, the complaints, the threats, the endless battles. He thought of Karen, sitting somewhere now, facing the consequences of her own cruelty. And he thought of how something as simple as a few chickens had taught him the power of endurance, the strength to stand quietly, firmly, and never back down from what was right. He picked up an egg from the nesting box, still warm from the hen that laid it, and smiled.
This was his peace. Hard won. Honest.
And for the first time in a long while, he finally believed it would last.